Welcome to Commissioner's Corner. I'm your host, City Commissioner Joe Roselle, and for my program today I have our City Manager Amy Sullivan and our Public Safety Director Andrew Pazhowski, and they'll be with me today to talk about public safety in our community and some of the things that the city's doing. I want to welcome you back. We've been off for a while due to the COVID pandemic, but now that we've sort of moved forward, we feel comfortable taping again, so hopefully this is something that we'll be bringing to you on a regular basis. So Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joe.
It's great to have you. Let's talk a little bit about Wayne State University and a presentation that Wayne State did for us. Let's tell the residents sort of why did the city ask Wayne State to do that presentation?
We asked them to look at three different things. One is we found out that some of our residents don't know that we're a public safety department, which means we don't have a standalone police department, we don't have a standalone fire department,
Sure.
that they're actually combined, and our officers are cross-trained to do both police duties and firefighter duties.
Right.
So we wanted to make that clear. Second thing we wanted to cover is that because defunding the police has been in the news lately, we wanted residents to understand that if we were to cut our public safety budget, it not only impacts police services, but also will impact fire service. So defunding police has a whole nother meaning when it comes to public safety departments. And then the third thing we asked them to look at is policies of police departments are also in the news. So we have a use of force policy and implicit bias policy, but they're like 4 or 5 pages long.
Sure.
So we asked the students to kind of distill that into bullet points so that it would be easier for residents to comprehend, and then we'll put the full policies on our website when this presentation is done. But we asked them to help to kind of distill that and make it easier to read.
That's good, and I think that is an important distinction about our public safety department, the police aspect, which maybe seem pretty obvious, but then this fire aspect and then the medical first responder, that these folks can get there before an ambulance and maybe render some type of assistance if someone's choking or whatever, that could make the difference really between someone living or someone dying. So I think that that's a great point and important that all of our residents sort of understand that. So the city, we are in budget talks now. Yes. We have a $8 million city budget that we very carefully manage. 33% of that budget is contributed to public safety, and we've heard some folks say, well, how does that compare to our surrounding communities? You know, some of our neighbors. How much of their budget is spent on public safety? So can we talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, we took a look at the Royal Oak budget. Royal Oak really isn't comparable to Huntington Woods on a couple of different levels. One is they levy, well, first of all, they have a separate police department and a separate fire department, so they are not public safety. And secondly, they are able to levy a public police millage, so they have their own police budget, so they're not ever going to be a percentage or a ratio of the general fund budget.
Right.
They have a standalone fund. But then we looked at Oak Park and Berkeley because they are also public safety units, and Oak Park's budget, about 50% is dedicated to public safety. Again, that's police, fire, and EMS services. Sure. And in Berkeley, public safety is 35% of their budget, and at Huntington Woods we're at 33%. So we're pretty comparable to the city of Berkeley.
That's great. So although public safety is a large portion of the city's budget, where a lot of those tax dollars go, as we look at our neighbors, we're pretty in sync with where everybody else is, or maybe even slightly a little less.
That's
so
right.
Yeah, when we hear about defunding and what that means to our budget, it's important to recognize, A, what that means and really how much of our budget it is actually going toward that function. So specifically on that public safety department budget, 88% is wages, salaries, fringe benefits, those types of things. And that's really set in a labor contract that the city negotiates with either the command union or the public safety officers union. So when folks say, oh, you should cut their budget by 10%, or you should give public safety a 20% reduction, can you talk about what that means to their budget, since so much of it is made up by salary and fringe benefits?
Yes, you're right. Since 88% is already set in contract and as wages and benefits, there isn't a lot of wiggle room in that budget. So the things that the balance of the budget pay for, things like training, supplies, operating supplies, equipment. So if we were going to reduce the public safety budget, we'd either have to cut training, we'd have to cut the operational supplies, which we need in order to have a well-functioning department, or we'd have to cut personnel. And we run a very lean department. We provide service on a 24/7 basis, 365 days a year. So we don't have extra personnel that we can lose. So we need all those things in order to have a well-functioning department, and they're just critical to being able to provide services to the residents.
Sure. And some people look at that budget and they say, well, the supplies, the materials budget, that must be weapons and ammunition, but it really goes beyond that. It's fire hoses, it's breathing apparatuses, it's the equipment that makes us be able to fight a fire and be able to respond if there's a medical issue. That when they see that, I think maybe some folks assume that it's all policing related, but because we provide three distinct functions there, it really covers all three, that particular budget, whether it's training, whether it's materials, supplies, etc. So I think this was important that we talk about this so that residents understand, before we bring our next guest on, sort of what the budget looks like and how it's structured in our city, which I think will give us some context for our next guest as we talk about that. So. Thank you very much for being here.
Happy to be here.
That's great. We are going to take a brief break for a public service announcement, and when we return, I'll have our public safety director on to talk about some issues specific to our public safety department. So we'll be right back after this break.
Hey guys, it's me, Isabella Gomez, filling in for Smokey Bear because he's got more to say than just...
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Like, if you're outside enjoying a barbecue, don't let a hamburger distract you from fire safety. Make sure you aren't dumping your hot coals or ashes onto the ground because that could start a wildfire. So take wildfire prevention seriously and let's save the world one day at a time. Juntos con Smokey Bear, podemos hacerlo. Go to smokeybear.com to learn more about wildfire prevention.
Welcome back. This is part 2 of our segment today, and I have with me as my guest our Public Safety Director, Andrew Pazhowski. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is your second time on the show.
Yes.
I had you on before. We talked about all the great services that our Public Safety Department provides to residents, sort of raise awareness on that. Today we're going to talk a little bit more specific about the department itself and some of the policies and some of the accolades and whatnot that we have and the good work that you folks do. So, Chief, one of the things that I want to talk about is this CALEA certification, and maybe talk a little bit about sort of what CALEA is. And I'm very proud that our department is CALEA accredited. And so could you talk a little bit about what CALEA stands for and what it means to be accredited?
Well, it's a national accreditation, obviously, for law enforcement agencies. The state of Michigan only has 11 at this time. In fact, a lot of Michigan agencies are being state accredited in lieu of national accreditation. So I think we're ahead of the curve. The difference is obviously we follow national standards. CALEA looks at the best practices across the country, not just within that state. And obviously a lot of the issues that we see aren't in Michigan, they're in other states. So that's what makes it so much better for us to follow those standards. It's such a bonus for us in Huntington Woods to have that accreditation. It ensures compliance with the best national standards in the country and that we follow those policies. And it forces us to have our checks and balances to make sure that occurs.
That's great.
And this way, if we do find any issues that need to be corrected, we can jump on that right away.
And so that stands for Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies.
Yes, it does.
Wow. And of all the police departments, public safety departments in our whole state, only 11 of them have went through the process and done what we've done.
Yes, it's very difficult. There's over 400 standards that we have to comply with. It's very time consuming, a lot of paperwork. in regards to getting compliance. And we're monitored by them quarterly, yearly, and then in fact we're up for accreditation next spring.
Okay.
It'll be our 4th.
Great.
So it is very difficult to keep, but as I said, it's for liability reasons and to assure the officers are doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's really well worth it.
And what benefit is there to residents for having this accredited department?
Well, they can rest assured to know that these officers, not only do they have the proper training, but they're complying with the standards and the policies that keep them safe and keep the officers safe.
And so we've seen a lot on the news, and certainly after the death of George Floyd, you know, police departments are certainly getting a second look these days. And I'd like to focus on the department's use of force policy. We'll talk maybe about bias in policing, traffic stops, and then this early warning system that we have. So let's start with training and talk about what type of training do our officers participate in, and how often are they required to go through that?
Well, as the city manager stated earlier, we are cross-trained. That means that we're state-certified police officers, state-certified firefighters, and state-certified medical first responders.
Okay.
That entails a lot of training for these guys. They receive approximately 200 hours of training a year in all these fields.
Wow.
And the training that they receive, some examples of the training that we do, they have implicit bias training, diversity training, ethics in the workplace, emergency vehicle operations, legal updates, de-escalation techniques, autism, crash investigations. Then you go into fire training, pump operations, fire ground operations, vehicle extrication. I can go on and on.
Sure.
And this training is done annually. A lot of it's done daily. The review of policies, there's over 100 policies the department has. So to ensure compliance and that the officers are up to date on their policies, those are reviewed during briefings at the station. So they're pretty much constantly training, doing something throughout the year. So all the training that they receive is annually. Some of it's face-to-face. A lot of it's over at the Oakland County Police Academy, Macomb County Police Academy, the Fire Crest Center at Oakland County.
Okay.
And then same thing with the firearms. It's either indoor over at Berkeley, or we have outdoor training also.
Oh, great.
So they just receive, there's a lot of training. Like I said, about 200 hours a year.
That's intense.
Yes.
So let's talk about if there was a traffic stop and maybe somebody felt like they received unfair treatment from the officer who pulled them over. What should a resident or non-resident, frankly, who's put in that situation and feels that they're in a traffic stop and they weren't treated fairly, what should they do?
Well, anytime that an individual feels they were treated improperly, they have choices. They could either call. If they feel they want to be anonymous, they could call the station, ask to speak to a supervisor, and we'll thoroughly investigate the complaint.
Okay.
If they feel comfortable with coming to the station, we would recommend that they come into the station, request to speak to a supervisor. The supervisor will interview them,
Okay.
the officer, and then continue on with a thorough investigation.
Okay. So there is a process, and if they want to remain anonymous because they're not comfortable coming forward, they could
Yes.
call in and just state the situation over the phone.
Yes, all complaints are investigated even if they don't want to file the complaint.
Okay.
It triggers, as soon as they call and say they had an issue, we start an investigation, even if they don't want to put it in writing. So however they wish to do that.
That's great.
Yeah.
And our department takes it serious. They conduct the investigation and follow through in all these different complaints.
Absolutely. CALEA requires it too under our early warning
Okay.
system. So when the call comes in, the supervisor, as I said, they'll interview the involved party. They'll interview the officer. They'll pull all the audio and video surveillance that we have on it. They'll interview any witnesses. Then they'll go through the policies and determine if any of our policies were violated.
Great. How many complaints would you say have been filed by citizens if we were to go back 6 years?
6 years, we've had five complaints.
Okay.
None of those complaints were related to use of force or racial profiling.
Okay.
A lot of those complaints typically, CLEA requires it to be filed, but a lot of them are actually contesting violations. They may come in and say, well, the officer said that I was speeding or I went through a red light, and they were contesting it. However, once they've called us, this still triggers our early warning system. We have to investigate it.
Okay.
Truly, that's handled in the court system.
Right.
Because it has nothing to do with the conduct of the officer.
Ticket, sure.
But in regards to our documentation, it's going to be listed as a complaint.
Okay. So in 6 years, no complaints have been registered for racial profiling or use of force violations.
That's right.
That's good.
Yes.
And like you said, on 11 Mile there, sometimes folks drive too fast. If they feel that maybe they weren't speeding, that's something that they would take into district court. And the officer makes their case, and the citizen makes their case, and the judge decides ultimately in that situation.
And that's some of the other complaints. They just feel like the officer wasn't friendly enough or courteous enough.
Okay.
And that's something we look at too, because the officer's part of their training is to be courteous and respectful.
Sure.
You know, it's very important that officers gain not only trust but respect from individuals, whether it's on a simple traffic stop or any other incident we might respond to.
That's great. Let's talk about the department's use of force policy, because there's been a lot of discussion on this, more so nationally, I think, because of what's been going on around the country. So let's talk a little bit about the use of force policy and are chokeholds permitted, et cetera.
Yeah, and in regards to our policy, it's very long and detailed. So as a summary of the policy, I think the most important for most people to know, as far as the use of force, it has to be reasonable and necessary. And you use the minimal force necessary to overcome somebody who's resisting. Okay. But with that being said, there has to be a lawful reason for the officer to be involved anyway.
All right.
So either it has to be a lawful arrest or in the protection of the officer or another individual from being harmed.
Okay.
That's basically the threshold for the use of force. Now, in the use of force, the officer, from the time of the call to the end of the incident, is going to be trying to de-escalate that incident. Mm-hmm. And that's with either verbal requests, verbal commands, trying to let them know that as I said, you want to gain their respect, you want to gain their trust, you want them to make sure they know we want this to end. We're not here to hurt anybody or to arrest anybody. We want to resolve their issue. Right. And we do what we can to de-escalate that. And that'll continue from the beginning to the end. Sometimes it works, and as you know, sometimes it doesn't. Sure. But still, the force starts very minimal. It's verbal initially, right? And then if none of those things work, if the officer's unable to de-escalate and it escalates, then the next step for the officer is hand controls, physical controls that they would use that they're trained on. These defensive tactics are trained on different hand maneuvers to try not to hurt the individual, but yet to control that person to be able to effect an arrest. Okay. If that doesn't work, we follow what they call a force continuum. So it starts with the verbal commands. It'll then go up to the physical hand controls, and then it'll go up to pepper spray. This is less than lethal. Pepper spray and the taser, those are considered less than lethal. Okay. If it still continues, and during that time they're still trying to talk this person down, trying to get them to calm down, trying to get them to comply with the officer's request. If it excels into a deadly force situation, unfortunately, that's when they could use deadly force, which would be their weapon. Okay. And obviously, we hope and pray that never happens. Absolutely. Sometimes you have no control. And
chokeholds aren't really permitted in our use of force policy.
When the chokeholds were brought up, in Michigan, we never had the training for chokeholds. Okay. We've never trained chokeholds. It's never been our policy to allow chokeholds. Got it. Other states have, though. So being CLIA accredited, those policies did come to us to put those in the policies. So I did immediately put those in the policies. Chokeholds cannot be used unless it falls under deadly force. So no, they can't use it to effect an arrest unless it's used as deadly force. Okay. That is in our policy. The right to render aid is now also in the policy. The officer must intervene if they see another officer using what they believe is excessive force. That's new, that's been added into the policy.
Great. So that protects that officer who feels like maybe a policy is being violated, that they feel comfortable being able to step in and stop that from occurring.
Absolutely.
That's important.
And they must do that or they're in violation of the policy.
That's very important.
Right.
And I think folks should understand that that's really designed to protect citizens, so that what we saw maybe nationally won't occur here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How do we monitor the policy? How do we make sure that the policy is being followed?
Well, as I said, not only in the through the professional standards summary, which is the early warning system, every single incident that an officer goes on, whether it's a police call or fire call, Those reports, those cases are reviewed by the supervisor.
Okay.
The report has to be approved by the supervisor. So that supervisor has to read the report, has to be aware exactly what happened on each officer on his shift, and then reviewed. If that supervisor sees that it's a use of force complaint, then there's other forms that need to be completed, and then a thorough investigation needs to be completed. The other thing that the officer or supervisors have to do periodically, like with traffic stops, periodically, which involves all the officers, they will take a videotape, they will pull violations, see what the violations are, and then review the tape and review the actions of the officers. So that's how we self-report. We're looking for these things on a daily basis, not receiving a complaint. We just do this on our own. That's
great.
Yeah.
So they're, checking on a regular basis just to see if even though they may not have gotten a complaint from a citizen, it still may rise to an area of concern just through internal checking procedures we have in our department.
Absolutely. If you look at the CLIA standards, or the summary, CLIA summary that I put on our annual report that is on our website, you'll see that the use of force incidents that we have, well, those are not complaints. Those are us self-reporting that the officer may have pulled his weapon. He effected a felony stop arrest. Those are not complaints. In fact, all over the almost 7 years I've been here, every year that we complete that, not one of those were a complaint. Those were from us self-reporting. So when people say, well, look at the use of force, they're looking at it as complaints. Those aren't citizen complaints. Those are investigations from the law enforcement agency to make sure that those officers complied. In every one of those cases, they were compliant.
Okay, excellent. Let's talk about body cams. So there's a lot of talk about body cams and the need for body cams. I think folks feel like that protects them, and I think it also protects the officer. If there's a situation that it's able to be recorded, that we shouldn't necessarily have to rely on bystanders with a smartphone to capture, a particular incident. So, do our officers wear body cams right now?
Right now, they do not.
Okay.
As most people know, it's very expensive. I requested this year in the budget, and it was approximately $37,000 a year for the body cameras and to update our system to make it state-of-the-art system that we need, not only the body cameras but the new cameras for the scout cars. So I'm very happy to say that it was approved. So July 1st, we'll have body cameras for all the officers. And you're right, not only does it protect the involved person, but it protects the officers from false accusations too. And then the person being stopped, the person being involved will feel more secure knowing that it's all videotaped, and there will always be some form of video and audio documentation of the incident.
Right. I think that's an important point to talk about. Some folks might think, well, can they turn the camera off in an incident or something like that? But the cameras have some type of protections in place. Obviously, if the officer's going into a restroom or someplace like that, they're going to need to be able to turn the camera off. But how would it work? What protections are in place to prevent that from happening during a traffic stop, say, for example?
In the beginning, when the cameras first came out, those were issues, right?
Right.
And unfortunately, it made it look like officers were purposely turning cameras off. But rest assured, that's not the case. When officers are going to lunch, they're going, like you say, to the men's room, they're turning them off and on, and when you have 100 things going through your head, or you're responding to a call, the first thing in your mind is what call you're responding to. So it can happen when you turn that camera off. Well, today, this equipment's state-of-the-art. Now, in fact, there'll be a sensor in the officer's holster of his weapon. There'll be a sensor in the officer's holster in his taser. Anytime the lights in the scout car are turned on, the siren is turned on. When the officer responds to a run from the car, it automatically activates. If they turn that camera off, it'll automatically turn on. So they have to physically turn it off, and if they forget to turn it on, it'll automatically still turn on when they're in the car. So that alleviates that issue with it not being on at the appropriate time. So it'll always be recorded.
So the technology's come a long way.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is time now now that's why I really believe it is the good time to make these purchases for these cameras.
Let's talk a little bit about traffic stops and sort of what is the department's policy on traffic stops?
Well, in regards to traffic stops, obviously racial filing is strictly prohibited. And you'd say, well, how do you know when it's happening? Well, as I said, we record. And if you look at the back of the annual report, which is on our website, you'll see I have all the violations that are written and who they're issued to. The supervisor is going to review each officer, see the tickets that they're issuing, see the traffic stops, make sure that they're in compliance, make sure there's no signs or evidence that there may be an issue with a certain officer.
Okay.
So that's how we comply. The officers are trained not to do that. And you have to remember, you know, I've been in law enforcement 35 years. I work traffic. And I'd have to say 95% of the people that I've stopped, I don't know who's driving that car till I walk up to the car. When we run radar, typically it's through a rear antenna, or even if it's from a front antenna of the scout car, you're picking up the speeding car blocks in front of you. So if I have a car that's going approximately 20 miles an hour, 15 over the speed limit, I have no idea who's driving that car. I know that it might be a silver SUV,
sure.
And then I'll monitor that car. And that's all on video also, so it shows the violation that's occurring, and it shows a traffic stop. So when we approach that car, we have no idea who's driving it until we get up to the car. So, you know, a lot of the criticism the officers are getting in regards to saying that as far as racial profiling, that people are being stopped because of the color of their skin, that's it's just not true. Our officers are very courteous at the traffic stops, and they're very respectful. Okay. And it's very difficult, though. You have to remember, you're ruining somebody's day. Somebody who's speeding, they're getting a ticket.
Nobody likes getting a speeding ticket.
They're going to be yelling, they're going to be upset, but the officer knows that and tries to be as calm as he can and respectful as he can to issue violations. But as I said, our supervisors are also trained and expected to monitor all the traffic stops that the officers are committing.
So it blocks back, you know, pick up a speeding vehicle, you can't even see who's driving. It goes by so fast because they're speeding. Absolutely. You can't necessarily see really until you pulled them over and gone up to the vehicle.
Absolutely.
And I will say too, our department's very transparent, unlike a lot of departments in the state, in that we actually track these tickets by race and whatnot because of CALEA, and it's monitored, right?
Yes, there are a lot of agencies. I think if you looked across the board, you'll see most agencies don't record that data. Where I used to work, we did not at that time, but we did not record that data. It wasn't recorded. It's recorded through the courts. The courts have the violations. They know from the violations, but nobody kept tally or looked at that and compared those statistics.
Right.
You know, because depending where you're running radar or the demographics of where you're at, it's going to determine who's being stopped also.
Sure.
But remember, the officers have no control over who the violators are. We have, whether they're male or female or how many of them, we have no control over that. So to look at that data and try to deduct that there's something issue there, it's not even reasonable because you have no control over who's committing the violations.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Your department produces an annual report.
Yes.
And that annual report is a public document that is available. I know the commission gets a copy of it. I get a copy of it every year. And I know it's also on our website. So could you talk a little bit about sort of the annual report and the contents, maybe some of the highlights of maybe our most recent annual report?
Yeah, when I came here in 2014, I noticed on the Oakland County departments didn't have annual reports because I looked on their websites. On the east side, we've all completed those, so I was real comfortable with them, and it was just good information for residents to have. And I brought in one of the old reports, but it covers so much information on the whole department. It'll cover police, fire, EMS. It has our mission statement in there. It's going to have the organizational chart, how the department's run. It's going to have the detective bureau, the cases that are solved, the cases that are open. It's going to have the number of index crimes, a breakdown, and non-index crimes, which is severe crimes and not so minor crimes. And it also has a 5-year breakdown, so you'll be able to see is there an increase in crime or a decrease in crime. Same thing with accidents, same thing with fires, motor vehicle or moving violations, and arrests will be on there. And then I also put in things like our fire safety open house, things that we do as far as good PR for the public. All that's in there also. I highly recommend the residents take a peek at that. It's on our city website. And also in the back this year, I've put on the professional standards, which is the early warning system through CALEA.
Okay.
And that shows in the early warning system, that's where the data is in regards to the complaints against officers, the use of force, vehicle pursuits, or bias-based policing analysis. All that's in that report. This has to be reviewed and looked at every year. So all that data is in there.
Okay.
And as I said, this data that's in there is data we created, not from somebody calling us and complaining.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I know when I looked at the annual report, and I've heard some feedback from residents too, they're surprised at the number of medical runs that we're involved with. And we're not exactly a huge city, but our officers are very busy with being that medical first responder and assisting on medical runs. It's not just policing, it's not just fire. That really, I was surprised at the number of medical runs we're involved with.
Absolutely. I think, to be honest with you, it's probably the majority of the calls for service that we have.
Sure.
Our officers are excellent at it. We do a lot of training on medical first response. We have the proper equipment that we need, oxygen and Narcan and epinephrine, and we can check people in regards to diabetes and things of that nature,
Sure.
and prepare them for when we call an advanced life support unit. Our officers are great. I give them kudos when I got on board here. How many times I've had calls from residents where the officer would respond to a medical, and then a week later the officer would go back to that home, knock on the door, and ask how that individual was doing, how their loved one was doing.
Yeah.
And I had so many calls. That's how these officers care about the residents.
Sure.
They're here to serve. Traffic enforcement is a very small part of our job. Random patrols is a big part, especially late at night in the morning through the residential area.
Yeah.
But traffic enforcement, believe it or not, is a very small part. The fire response too, we run mutual aid departments, so we're in Oak Park, we're in Berkeley and Beverly Hills. So we have a lot of fire runs the officers have to go on too.
I agree. In my 6 years on the commission, I've received a number of emails regarding our public safety officers, and they have all been positive,
Yes.
Either from our residents or from non-residents who happen to be either passing through the city or on one of the perimeter streets, and they were involved in a traffic accident or some situation that involved our public safety department, a medical issue in the Rite Aid store, and Jay just raved about how professional and caring they were. So I do share your feelings on that. I think our folks do a great job. And this annual report is on our website. That's www.hwmi.org, and then you can click on the Public Safety Department, and that'll give you access to that annual report. So, Chief, I appreciate you being here today and answering these questions and helping our citizens understand, our department and all the different services we provide and our policies and procedures, and I think it's a great thing. And I'm very proud that we're CALIA certified and that you go through that process of ensuring that we have that accreditation and that we continue to do that. I'd also like to thank the Wayne State University students who helped put together the report that we used in our discussion earlier in the program with Amy, and that the commission has reviewed, and that our chief has reviewed. And I think the students did a great job, and I just wanted to personally thank them for the work that they did, the Wayne State University graduate students. So that's all I have for today's program, and now that we've hopefully made it through the worst of the COVID situation, I'll be back on a much more regular basis with shows that are of interest to all of you and happenings in our city. So for now, it'll be farewell until our next show. Just remember that if there's anything I can do, if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the city, you can always reach me by email. My email address is jrozell@hwmi.org. Thank you very much for watching, and if you missed the entire show today, it'll be rebroadcast on a regular basis, so if you only caught a portion, just check the city's website for the broadcast schedule when you'll be able to catch the whole show. Thank you for watching.